The sun had set on the planet Varian, casting a faint orange hue over its vast, arid plains. The horizon stretched endlessly, interrupted only by the distant mountains. It was once a world of peace and prosperity, a place where the people had lived in harmony with nature and each other. But all of that had changed a century ago. The Zortians, an aggressive alien species with a brutal reputation, arrived without warning. Their ships descended from the sky like dark clouds, casting shadows over the land. The people of Varian tried to resist, fighting back with everything they had, but they were no match for the Zortian war machines. The invaders were ruthless, and the resistance was crushed in a matter of days. For the next 100 years, Varian's people lived under a constant state of siege. The Zortians surrounded the planet with an unbreakable blockade, preventing any outside help from reaching the planet. Food and resources dwindled, and the people's hope began to fade. They were trapped, prisoners on their own world, with no way to escape the endless cycle of war. The Zortians ruled with an iron fist, watching every move the inhabitants made, ensuring that no rebellion would rise against them. The people of Varian had tried everything. They had tried diplomacy, offering peace, but the Zortians laughed it off. They had tried to strike back, launching attacks in the dead of night, but each attempt was met with swift and brutal retaliation. As time passed, their strength weakened, and their spirits withered. Many had lost their loved ones to the Zortian onslaught, and countless others had given up hope of ever seeing their world free again. The siege was endless, and there seemed to be no way out. But even in the darkest of times, there was always a glimmer of hope. The people of Varian had heard rumors of a group of warriors from another world, warriors who were unlike anything they had ever seen before. These warriors were known as Deathworlders, and they were feared across the galaxy. They were not born on peaceful worlds like Varian. They were born on harsh, deadly planets where survival was a constant struggle. Their strength, agility, and endurance were unmatched, and their skills in combat were legendary. The Deathworlders had the ability to thrive in the most dangerous environments, and they had fought and won battles against some of the most fearsome species in the galaxy. When word spread that the Deathworlder cadets were being sent to Varian to end the century-long siege, there was a spark of hope among the people. The very thought that someone, anyone, could break the Zortian blockade seemed impossible, but the Deathworlders were different. They were known for their courage, their skill, and their unrelenting determination. If anyone could succeed, it would be them. The cadets were not yet full-fledged soldiers. They were young, only just beginning their training, but they had been chosen for their unique skills and potential. They were the best of the best, selected from various death worlds, where they had been trained under the harshest conditions imaginable. And now, they were about to face their greatest test yet. The Zortians knew that the Deathworlder cadets were coming. Their scouts had reported strange ships entering the system, ships that didn't belong to any known faction. The Zortians were prepared for a fight, but they were confident that their overwhelming forces could easily crush any resistance. They didn't know who these Deathworlders were or what they were capable of. But they would soon find out. The cadet's ship descended through the atmosphere, cutting through the clouds like a blade. Inside, the young warriors were focused and calm, preparing themselves for the battle ahead. They had been trained for this moment, but even they couldn't ignore the weight of the task that lay before them. The Zortian blockade had lasted for a century, and the odds were stacked against them. The Zortians were numerous, and their weapons were advanced. It seemed like an impossible task, but the cadets had one advantage. They were Deathworlders, and they never gave up. As the ship touched down, the cadets disembarked, stepping onto the dusty soil of Varian for the first time. They could feel the oppressive weight of the blockade all around them, the sense of a world trapped under the heel of its conquerors. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and fear, but the cadets were undeterred. They had come here with one goal in mind: to break the siege, to free the people of Varian, and to end the century of suffering. The Zortians were not prepared for what was coming. They had faced countless enemies over the years, but they had never faced Deathworlders. They didn't know what to expect, and that would be their downfall. The Cadets quickly assessed their surroundings. The Zortians had established a heavy presence on the surface, with large fortified bases scattered across the planet. Their forces were spread thin, but they were well equipped and prepared for any threat. The Cadets knew that in order to succeed, they would need to strike fast, hit hard, and take out the Zortian command structure before the enemy had a chance to react. With no time to waste, the Cadets set out on their mission. They moved swiftly, covering ground faster than the Zortians could respond. Every step was calculated, every movement precise. They were like shadows, disappearing into the landscape before the Zortians could even react. The Cadets knew that they had one chance to make this work. They couldn't afford to waste time or resources. They had to end the siege in 20 minutes, or the entire mission would fail. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was building with every passing second. But the Cadets didn't let fear take hold. They were Deathworlders, and they were ready to prove that nothing was impossible, not even ending a century-long siege in less than half an hour. As the Cadets advanced, the Zortians began to notice something strange. Their patrols were being wiped out, one by one, without warning. Small, quick attacks came out of nowhere, and the enemy had no way of tracking the Deathworlders' movements. The Zortians were disoriented, unsure of what was happening. It wasn't just the Cadets' speed that was surprising them. It was their uncanny ability to adapt to any situation, no matter how dangerous. The siege was crumbling. The Zortians' confidence was wavering, and the once impenetrable blockade was starting to show signs of weakness. The people of Varian could feel the change in the air. The fear that had gripped them for so long began to fade, replaced by a cautious hope. Could this be the moment they had been waiting for? The Deathworlder Cadets were about to show the galaxy what they were capable of. As the Deathworlder Cadets continued their advance, they were fully aware of the immense pressure on their shoulders. Every step they took, every action they executed, brought them closer to their goal, but also closer to potential failure. The Zortians were relentless, and the stakes were astronomical. A century of siege, destruction, and suffering had taken its toll on the planet and its people, but now, finally, there was a glimmer of hope. The Cadets knew they had no time to waste. The longer they lingered in the open, the more likely it would be for the Zortians to regroup and retaliate. They needed to act quickly, decisively. Their training had prepared them for everything from survival in hostile environments to combat under the most extreme conditions, but now they faced a unique challenge, breaking the century-long blockade in less than half an hour. The silence that had descended over the Zortian command center was broken by the distant sounds of explosions, the crackling of energy blasts, and the screams of Zortian soldiers who had been caught off guard. The Cadets' tactical strikes were relentless. They moved with precision, each action purposeful, each strike calculated for maximum disruption. The Zortians were disoriented, unsure of what they were facing. What the Zortians didn't know was that the Cadets weren't just battling them with superior combat skills. They were exploiting their own weaknesses. The Zortians were a technologically advanced race, their war machines powerful and terrifying. But they lacked adaptability. They relied on brute strength, on sheer numbers, and on their imposing technology. They didn't understand the tactics of the Deathworlders, who had survived and thrived in environments far more hostile than the Zortian invasion ever could be. The Cadets swiftly cut through the Zortian ranks, hitting their supply lines, sabotaging their weapons, and causing confusion within the enemy's command structure. The longer the siege had lasted, the more overconfident the Zortians had become. They had grown accustomed to being unchallenged, to being in control. But now, a new force had emerged, one that was unstoppable. The key to their success lay in their speed. With each passing second, the Cadets inched closer to their ultimate objective, the Zortian command center, the heart of their occupation on Varian. The entire operation hinged on the success of this final blow. The command center housed the Zortian leadership, their strategic brain trust. If the Cadets could take it down, they would cripple the Zortians' ability to command their forces and hold the siege intact. But as the Cadets approached the heart of the Zortian stronghold, the enemy grew aware of their presence. They had underestimated the Deathworlders before, but now they realized they were facing something entirely different. The Zortian commanders scrambled to rally their forces, dispatching reinforcements in a desperate bid to stop the assault. But it was too late. The Deathworlders had already infiltrated the base. Their presence was as silent as it was deadly. They knew that speed was the key. There was no time for hesitation, no time for mistakes. If they failed, the siege would continue for another century. They couldn't let that happen. Inside the heart of the command center, the Cadets faced the final challenge. The Zortian leaders, who had held Varian under their control for 100 years, stood at the ready. They had their elite guards, their most powerful weapons, and their advanced technology. But it was not enough. The Deathworlders moved in unison, striking swiftly and without mercy. Their weapons were simple compared to the Zortian arsenal, but they were efficient, and their skill unmatched. Within minutes, the Cadets had taken out the Zortian guards, leaving the leaders vulnerable. A fierce battle ensued within the walls of the command center, but the Cadets never faltered. They had come here for one purpose, to end the siege, and they would not be denied. The battle was brutal, the odds still stacked against them. But the Deathworlders had an advantage, their unyielding resolve. The Zortians could feel it in the air, the fear, the chaos, and the realization that they were losing. It was at that moment, as the Zortian commanders realized they were facing certain defeat, that the truth became clear. The century-long siege was over. The Deathworlders had broken through, not just the enemy lines, but the very heart of the Zortian occupation. The unstoppable force had proven to be too much for the Zortians, who were now running out of time, resources, and hope. But even with the command center under their control, the battle was far from over. The Cadets had managed to cripple the Zortians' leadership, but they had not yet won the war. The Zortians still had reinforcements on the way, and they were far from finished. However, the Deathworlders had shown that they could adapt, outsmart, and defeat an enemy that had once seemed invincible. For the people of Varian, the weight of a century-long siege was finally beginning to lift. Hope, once thought impossible, had returned. The Deathworlder Cadets had defied all odds and were well on their way to breaking the chains that had held the planet captive for so long. The Zortians had underestimated their enemies, and now the Deathworlders would make them pay. The Cadets' success in breaking the Zortian siege wasn't just a matter of tactical superiority. It was a story of unwavering determination, of pushing past limits that most would consider impossible. With each successful strike, each obstacle overcome, the Cadets found themselves rewriting the rules of warfare. They had entered enemy territory, infiltrated the Zortian stronghold, and taken down what was once thought unassailable. But there was still one critical step to take, the final push to fully break the siege and ensure that the Zortians could never regroup. As they neared the heart of the Zortian stronghold, the air grew thick with tension. The noise of battle raged in the distance, but here, in the deepest corridors of the enemy base, there was only silence. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet before the final clash. The Cadets, young but fiercely trained, moved swiftly through the darkened hallways, their footsteps almost undetectable. They had been through countless drills, simulations, and survival exercises, but nothing could prepare them for what lay ahead. They were walking into the belly of the beast. The Zortian Command Center was a sprawling complex, filled with high-tech weaponry, shields, and reinforcements. The building's walls were made of a material resistant to most standard weapons, yet the Cadets were undeterred. Their training had prepared them for every possible scenario, and they knew how to adapt when faced with a challenge. The siege had lasted 100 years, and no one, not even the fiercest warriors, had been able to break it. But the Deathworlder cadets were not like any other soldiers. They had one weapon that the Zortians could not counter: speed. In less than 30 minutes, they had crippled the enemy's outer defenses, left their forces in disarray, and now they were heading straight for the heart of their operation. But the Zortians, realizing they were losing control, began to regroup. They understood that if the cadets reached the command center, the entire siege would collapse. They had no choice but to make their final stand. The cadets didn't hesitate. They had no room for fear. The Zortians had underestimated them from the start, believing that their century-long siege was unbeatable. But the Deathworlders had defied that belief. And now it was time for them to end this once and for all. As they approached the central control room, the cadets knew they had reached the most critical point of the operation. They could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. The Zortians, who had been so confident in their dominance, were now scrambling to save themselves. But it was too late. The Deathworlders were too fast, too skilled, and too determined to be stopped. The final battle would be fought in the heart of the command center. The cadets knew the risks. They were about to face the highest-ranking Zortian officers, the elite forces that had kept the siege going for so long. But they were ready. Each step brought them closer to victory, and with every move, they proved that they were the true masters of warfare. Inside the command center, the Zortian commanders were panicked. They had never faced an enemy like this before: swift, relentless, and seemingly unstoppable. They sent reinforcements, but it wasn't enough. The Deathworlders had already infiltrated the heart of their operation, and now a final blow was imminent. The Zortians made their last stand, but it was a battle they could not win. The cadets, having already shattered the siege, moved with precision and efficiency. Each Zortian officer who tried to fight back was swiftly overpowered. It was a complete collapse of the once unstoppable Zortian forces. In less than 20 minutes, the Deathworlders had ended the century-long siege. The Zortians were left in complete disarray. Their leadership had been dismantled, their reinforcements defeated, and their strategic stronghold utterly crippled. There was nothing they could do but retreat. The once mighty Zortian force that had held Varian in its grip for so long was now on the verge of collapse, and it was the Deathworlder cadets who had brought them to their knees. The cadets didn't celebrate their victory. Not yet. They knew that the war wasn't over. But for the people of Varian, for the soldiers who had fought and bled for this moment, this was the end of an era. The siege that had lasted for over 100 years had finally come to an end, and the Deathworlders had made it possible. As the cadets stood victorious, their mission was far from complete, but they had proven one undeniable fact. When faced with the impossible, they didn't just survive. They triumphed. The news of the Deathworlder cadets' victory spread like wildfire across Varian. The once feared Zortian siege, which had oppressed the planet for a century, was now broken, thanks to a group of young soldiers who had defied all odds. The galaxy had watched with skepticism as the cadets entered enemy territory. But now, their actions had shattered that doubt. The tide of war had turned, and the story of these remarkable young warriors became a symbol of hope and resilience across the universe. But with the siege broken, there was still the question of what would come next. The Zortian forces were reeling, and their retreat left Varian with both a sense of relief and uncertainty. The Deathworlders' success had been monumental, but the Zortians would not simply fade away. Their pride had been wounded, their confidence shattered, and they would surely regroup to strike again. For the cadets, however, this was not just about victory. It was about proving that their training, their skills, and their courage could bring change. With the siege lifted, the cadets were called to the forefront as heroes. They were no longer just students or soldiers in training. They had become legends. But as they stepped into the spotlight, they remained humble. They knew that their mission had only just begun. The Zortian forces, though broken, still had a foothold on other parts of the galaxy, and their quest for dominance was far from over. The cadets returned to their commanders, who were already planning their next move. The victory at Varian had crippled the Zortian siege, but the fight was far from over. The Deathworlder's success had bought them time, but it had also made them targets. The Zortians, though battered, would not take this loss lightly. The galaxy was watching, waiting to see how the Deathworlders would respond to the next phase of the war. In the aftermath of the battle, the Cadets had become the face of a new era of warfare. Their actions had shattered expectations and rewritten the rules of engagement. The galaxy had seen the Deathworlders' potential, and now they knew the cost of underestimating them. The Cadets had proven that even in the most dire situations, they could outsmart, outmaneuver, and overpower their enemies. But as much as the victory at Varian had boosted morale, it had also exposed the harsh realities of war. The Cadets had been pushed to their limits, facing dangers and challenges that most would have considered insurmountable. Yet, in the face of adversity, they had persevered. The Cadets' success was a reminder that even the most impossible tasks could be accomplished with the right mindset and the right training. With the siege over, the Deathworlders knew that their work was far from finished. The Zortians were already regrouping, preparing for their next move. The Cadets would have to be ready for whatever came next. But now, with the weight of their success behind them, they stood as a symbol of the Deathworlders' strength. The galaxy knew that the fight was far from over, but now they had seen what a small group of Cadets could achieve. And that was just the beginning. The final battle was not yet fought, but the Cadets had proven that even in the darkest of times, hope could emerge. Their victory had shown that the impossible was possible, and with it, they had inspired a galaxy to rise against the forces that sought to dominate it. The Deathworlder Cadets had not just won a battle, they had ignited a fire that would burn across the stars, lighting the way for those who would stand against tyranny, no matter the cost. As the Cadets took their first moments of rest since their overwhelming victory, they understood that they couldn't afford to relax for long. The Zortians, humiliated by their swift defeat, were not a force to be written off so easily. Their pride had been shattered, and the vast empire they commanded would surely take steps to regain their honor. Their anger would drive them to seek revenge, and the Cadets knew this well. Yet, despite this looming threat, the Deathworlders had learned something crucial in the heat of battle. They were not like any other force the galaxy had ever seen. The war was far from over, and this victory would be but a small chapter in the ongoing struggle for dominance. The Deathworlder Cadets had cracked open a door, and behind it lay a battlefield unlike any they had imagined. The consequences of their actions were just beginning to unfold. After the battle, the Cadets were hailed as heroes, their names whispered across the galaxy as symbols of courage, strength, and resilience. But for the Cadets themselves, the recognition meant little. They had never fought for glory or fame. They had fought to protect those who could not protect themselves. It was a mission they took on with solemnity, understanding that their work was far from finished. In the coming weeks, the Deathworlders continued to work alongside their commanders, pushing the Zortian forces back even further. They were relentless, unwilling to let the enemy regroup. They knew the Zortians would be coming back, but the Cadets were ready. They had proven their mettle on the battlefield, and they had a deep understanding of what their enemy was capable of. The Zortians had made the mistake of thinking the Cadets were just young soldiers. They had no idea what Deathworlders were truly capable of when pushed to their limits. The Deathworlder forces, emboldened by their success, launched a series of strategic strikes across the galaxy. But each victory only brought more challenges. The Zortians adapted quickly, learning from their mistakes and reorganizing their forces. The Cadets were prepared for this. The battle that had been won on Varian was only the beginning of a long war. Every victory would bring new threats, new challenges. The Cadets knew this, and they stood ready for whatever came next. Even as the Deathworlder Cadets grew in strength and reputation, they were constantly reminded of the heavy toll war took. The victory at Varian had been hard-earned, and it had come at a cost. Many of their fellow soldiers had fallen during the conflict. Some of the Cadets had experienced loss firsthand, losing comrades who had trained alongside them. The battle had not been without sacrifice, and it was a reminder that even the most victorious moments were often tinged with pain. The war was far from over, and the cadets knew they would face many more battles before it ended. But with each fight, they became stronger, more skilled, and more determined. They knew what was at stake. They had seen the price of failure, and they had felt the weight of their responsibility. The galaxy depended on them, and they would not fail. As they moved from one battle to the next, the Deathworlder cadets grew more than just soldiers. They became symbols of hope, of what was possible when people stood together and fought for a cause greater than themselves. They were a force that no one could ignore, and their reputation spread far and wide. Their victory at Varian had opened the door to something much larger, a future where they would stand as the galaxy's strongest defenders, united against the forces that sought to bring it down. But even with their growing strength, the cadets understood that victory would not come easily. The Zortians would not give up their quest for power. They would continue to fight. But the cadets were ready. Their training had prepared them for this very moment. They would not rest until the galaxy was safe from the threat of tyranny. In the end, the Deathworlder cadets would become legends, not just for their victory at Varian, but for their relentless pursuit of justice, their refusal to back down in the face of impossible odds. The galaxy would remember the day they broke the century-long siege, and the young warriors who made it possible. Their story was far from over, but for now, they had shown the galaxy that no enemy, no matter how powerful, could ever stand against the might of a united force of Deathworlders. The galaxy, once uncertain of the Deathworlders' capabilities, now looked to them as the ultimate hope. Varian had marked the beginning of something extraordinary. The cadets had proven that no matter the odds, even a group of young soldiers could overcome the impossible. But the victory came at a cost. It was a bitter reminder that the galaxy was not safe, and the Zortians, despite their defeat, were far from finished. In the months following the fall of the siege, the Deathworlder forces regrouped. They had proven themselves, but the war was far from over. The Zortians were recovering, licking their wounds, and plotting their next move. And they were not the only threat in the galaxy. Other factions, watching the rise of the Deathworlders, saw them as a threat to their own power and dominance. The universe had entered a new phase of uncertainty, where alliances would shift, new dangers would emerge, and the balance of power was anything but certain. The cadets, now seasoned veterans, continued their training, knowing full well that their mission was far from complete. Every victory, no matter how small, brought them one step closer to the ultimate goal, peace. But they also understood that this peace was fragile. Every decision they made, every move they took, would shape the future of the galaxy. They were no longer just following orders. They were shaping the course of history. The world of war had become their reality, and it was a harsh one. The cadets had learned to adapt quickly. What had once been a dream to them, the thought of becoming soldiers who could defend the galaxy, was now their everyday life. But with this responsibility came burdens. Each mission, each battle, reminded them that war was not glamorous. It was brutal, it was costly, and it was unrelenting. But despite the darkness that surrounded them, the cadets never wavered. They had seen firsthand the difference they could make. They had turned the tide of a century-long siege in 20 minutes. They knew that victory was possible, even in the most dire of circumstances. And this belief gave them the strength to keep fighting, to keep moving forward, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. While the cadets prepared for their next move, the rest of the galaxy watched with bated breath. Would they be able to maintain their momentum? Could they truly bring an end to the constant cycle of violence and war? The Deathworlders had proven their might, but the question remained, could they build the lasting peace? The galaxy had seen the destructive potential of these young warriors, but it had also seen their determination, their resolve, and their unwavering commitment to protect those who could not protect themselves. The next stage of the war would be even more difficult than the first. The Zortians, though weakened, were still a formidable force. They would not be easily defeated. And the galaxy's other factions, while initially hesitant to challenge the Deathworlders, were now taking notice. No one knew what the future would hold, but one thing was clear. The Deathworlders were no longer just a force to be reckoned with. They were the new leaders of the galaxy, standing at the precipice of a future where they would shape the course of history. The Cadets had won a battle, but they knew that the real war was just beginning. They had proved their worth on the battlefield, but now they would have to prove it again in the greater war for the galaxy's future. Their strength would be tested, their resolve would be challenged, and their courage would be pushed to its limits. But the Cadets were ready. They had faced impossible odds before, and they would face them again. And as the Deathworlder forces gathered, preparing for the next battle, the galaxy knew that one thing was certain. The Deathworlders were here to stay. They had shown what they were capable of, and now they would fight for the future of the galaxy. The age of the Deathworlder Cadets had begun, and the universe would never be the same. The war had shifted. The Deathworlders were no longer just soldiers. They were leaders, strategists, and symbols of hope for the galaxy's oppressed. Their rise had sparked fear, admiration, and intrigue in equal measure. And while the Cadets had been thrust into a conflict they hadn't fully anticipated, they had grown beyond what anyone could have imagined. They were now the galaxy's best hope for peace, or perhaps its greatest weapon in an ongoing struggle for control. Despite the glory that came with their victories, the Cadets remained humble. They knew the war was far from over. They had faced down a century-long siege, but they had only scratched the surface of the Zortian threat. The Cadets' names were now known across the galaxy, whispered by the oppressed and feared by their enemies. But with this notoriety came responsibility. They couldn't afford to rest. Each victory had its cost, and the stakes were higher than ever. The galaxy's political landscape had begun to shift dramatically. As the Deathworlders continued to gain influence, they also made enemies. Enemies who had once underestimated them, but now saw them as a threat to their own power. The galaxy was filled with factions that would do anything to maintain their control. The war was no longer just about defeating the Zortians. It had become a battle for the soul of the galaxy itself. For the Cadets, the task ahead was immense. They had to navigate this complex web of alliances, conflicts, and shifting loyalties. The battlefield was not just on the ground, but in the hearts and minds of those who would choose sides. It was a war for the future, and the Deathworlders were now at the center of it all. But even in the face of growing tension and escalating stakes, the Cadets remained focused. They had seen what was at stake, a galaxy teetering on the edge of destruction, its people caught in the crossfire of endless war. Their mission was clear, and they had already proven that they could achieve the impossible. The battle for the galaxy's future was now in their hands. As the days passed, the Deathworlder Cadets continued to lead the charge against the Zortian forces. The Zortians, humiliated by their defeat, had retreated to regroup and lick their wounds. But they weren't defeated yet. The Zortian Empire had been shaken, but not broken. The galaxy knew that they would be back, stronger than before. And so, the Cadets trained harder, pushing themselves beyond their limits. They knew that every day they spent preparing brought them one step closer to securing the galaxy's future. But the war was a long and grueling one. The Zortians would not go down easily. The Cadets would have to prove themselves again and again, on the battlefield and in the hearts of the galaxy's citizens. But as they faced each challenge, the Deathworlders grew stronger. Their unity, their shared purpose, and their unwavering resolve made them a force to be reckoned with. The galaxy, once divided, began to unite under their banner. The hope of peace was not lost, but the road to it would be difficult. In the end, the Deathworlder Cadets would become more than just soldiers. They would become legends, their story told across the stars as a testament to the power of determination, courage, and unity. They had proven that even the most impossible situations could be overcome, and they had given the galaxy a glimpse of what could be achieved when people fought together for a better future. But the true victory would not come from a single battle. It would come from the countless sacrifices, the unyielding spirit of the Deathworlders, and their unshakable belief that they could change the galaxy for the better. They had shown the universe that even the darkest moments could be overcome. They had proven that, no matter the odds, the fight for justice and peace was always worth it. And as the Deathworlder cadets prepared for whatever came next, the galaxy knew one thing for sure. Their story was far from over. It was just beginning.